See, that's another thing. When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them. On the other hand, uh, because of the way this society is organized, because of the violence that exists on the surface everywhere, you have to expect that there are going to be such explosions. You have to expect things like that as reactions. If you are a black person and live in the black community all your life and walk out on the street every day seeing white policemen surrounding you, when I was living in Los Angeles, for instance, long before the situation in LA ever occurred, I was constantly stopped. No, the police didn't know who I was, but I was a black woman. I had a natural, and they, I suppose, thought that I might be a quote militant. And when you live under a situation like that constantly, uh, and then you ask me, whether I approve of violence. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense at all.
Cops. We all fear because we would have had a very rude, bad encounter for at least once with a cop. But aren't cops are supposed to serve the public, protect the interests of the society, look after that the society doesn't collapse, and jail the antisocial elements which try to break the society down, like murderers, thieves, and rapists? Then how dare that people like me are talking against an institution which is designed to serve us? Wait, you haven't heard me, and I will try my best to convince you that all cops are bastards. To understand policing of present, we have to understand its origin and history, so that we would know that what was the actual idea or the intention behind. And remember that you would feel, why do I need to know this? But trust me, it's all related. So hang on with me. We have to date back to the ancient Egyptian civilization, that is 3000 BCE, to get first records of policing as we know of now. The pharaoh or the king used to appoint an official who used to enforce laws, collect taxes, and maintain order. In ancient Greece, to be specific, in the city of Athens, there were Scythian archers who worked for the state to maintain order. Maintaining order here means suppressing riots or any kind of protests. Fun fact, these archers were slaves who were bought from Scythia, modern day Ukraine. When I got to know this, I thought, how can a group of people who maintain order can be slaves at the same time? Isn't that contradictory? It's like you get to oppress a fellow slave, like farmers, for example, whereas you are being enslaved by the elites. You are enforcing slavery by being a slave yourself. Before the explanation, let me give some more similar examples. In ancient Rome, there were vigiles and lictors. Vigiles used to work as firefighters and night watch units, and lictors served as the bodyguards for the state officials. So, going back to the question, why does the slave used to obey the state when they can organize with the other slaves and fight? I need you to understand the system. There are upper strata of magistrates who are appointed by the king and who control the slave officers. And these slave officers often did the dirty work like patrolling, firefighting, arresting, punishing, and others. These people were slaves who were bought from the other place. So they didn't have any other place to call as a home. Moreover, that they were given freedom of being violent over other citizens and slaves, alienating them from the citizens. This alienation and helplessness made them to obey their masters, which were the elites. And also, the state, which were mostly led by the elites, used to legitimize murder and violence on the slaves. These things gave them a sense of power over other citizens. So, they worked together to protect and stabilize the hierarchy that existed. For example, the vigiles used to be violent over the plebeians in ancient Rome. The Spartans had a secret army of young elites. Cryptae used to declare wars on the helots. Mind you, helots were just a bunch of farmers who were one of the lowest in the hierarchy of the caste system. In medieval Europe, there were citizen led night watchers who were called the chalice. who used to guard the town against thefts or fires. There were local courts, which were led by the mason chosen by the monarchy, who enforced the laws and served justice. There were sheriffs who collected taxes and mobilized local militias to chase the criminals. In other parts of the world, like in Africa, centralized kingdoms like the Zulu and the Ashanti had chiefs or kings maintained order through loyal warriors or messengers. Well, when colonialists came to places like the Asia and Africa, they recruited the locals or the natives for the dirty works of policing, as I mentioned earlier. Yep, if you didn't know, colonialists did treat them as slaves. We will discuss it in detail later, but let's know some more examples. In ancient China, that is 11th century BCE onwards, there was a Baojia system which organized people in 10, 100,000, and each unit is responsible to policing its members. Later, during the period of imperial China, yamen runners acted as police under imperial magistrates. In Japan, there were samurai class, served as both warriors and enforcers during the feudal era. During the period of Tokugawa shogunate, he established a centralized police force to monitor feudal lords and suppress dissent. It was the same in Americas as well. To contrast it with the times when humans lived in tribes, the tribal policing was based on kinship ties and reciprocal obligations. Harming a member of the tribe was seen as harming the entire group, and retaliation was often collective. Elders, chiefs, or shamans often acted as a moral authority who solved the disputes and served justices. And most importantly, these early tribes were egalitarian, which meant that the power was distributed among members rather than concentrated in a central authority. So, this made policing a collective responsibility, in contrast with the societies of feudal age, which was divided among caste hierarchies, and policing was a centralized force. Let's analyze what we learned from these examples. When the human societies were forming, policing didn't exist as it evolved during the feudal age. Instead, people themselves used to police themselves. Basically, the safety of each and every member of the community was a collective responsibility of each and every member of the society. But later, when civilizations and cities started to form, the king started to evolve from the chiefs and elders. This king now had influence on the daily lives of people and he started enjoying power. But later, when civilizations and cities started to form, the king started to evolve. The chiefs and the elders evolved into kings by accumulating power and influence on the daily lives of people. The xenophobia and a sense of outcast to people from other communities or tribe and a touch of religion, traditions, rituals caused the society to develop a caste system and a slave system. I know I'm overgeneralizing, but you get the idea, right? The people who now had the power to control people's lives wanted the system to continue. So, to make sure, the king appointed some magistrates to maintain the law and order, which were essentially interested in maintaining the status quo, which is feudalism and monarchy. And that was possible by a policing system, which did everything to control the people, from maintaining the law and order to collecting taxes from the serfs, from firefighting and patrolling to guarding the magistrates and harassing the fellow slaves. They were slaves of the state who were given the power to be violent without any restrictions. But humans are humans. Resistance is an emotion every person has. Some bury it and some embrace it. So, to punish the resistors, they used to make them slaves or exile them or simply executed them. Well, this analysis was a general and a simplified view. After addressing that, according to our analysis, that's what the idea behind policing and prison systems. Now we will connect colonialism, capitalism, imperialism, slavery, and all together. So, hang on. Then happened the most important thing in the history of humanity, transition from feudalism to capitalism. The French Revolution happened because the sense of liberty, equality, and fraternity started arising in people. Well, even that's a brief history, but for the video's sake, gotta keep it short. That was followed with Industrial Revolution. So suddenly the people who only had the power over wealth, now also were able to have access in politics. Remember that wasn't the remember that wasn't possible under monarchy. Whatever institution the monarchy or the political authority had access over now was accessible for the capital owners, including the policing system. Now the capital owners started using this institution against the protesters or people who disturb order, who were workers and laborers and socialists, and also they needed an institution to protect their private property, and that requirement was also fulfilled by the cop industry. Examples being the London Metropolitan Police, 1829, and both state runners were created to suppress working class movements like Luddites who resisted mechanization of their workplaces and also asked for fair wages. But the British Parliament cracked down on them by passing the law which made breaking a machine a punishable offense, that too with death penalty. The law was called the Frame Breaking Law of 1812. There was suspension of habeas corpus, which gave accused or the arrested to challenge the arrest, and that was also suspended. In the US South, slave patrols used to have constant surveillance and brutalize the enslaved African Americans to maintain plantation economies. After the emancipation, they were involved in maintaining the Jim Crow policies, which strengthened the racial capitalism. In colonial India, the Katwals and the Thanedars used to suppress any kind of dissent and protests which were against the interests of the Britishers, that is, the colonialists. And surprisingly, and at the same time not surprisingly, these lower state officers were all Indians who were helping the Britishers to suppress the freedom movement, the freedom of their own people. What does these incidences tell us? The police system, which used to work and act accordingly to the interests of the state, now as a system took a turn from feudalism to capitalism, the policing institutions work for the interests of the capitalists, whether it be a colonial state or an imperial state or a democratic state, whether the state is against the interests of the masses or the policing institution is filled with natives or the same class slash working class people, they will always work for the interests of the people in power. Let's start with suppression of labor union protests. The Haymarket affair happened in May in 1866 in Chicago. The cops arrived at the place where labor protests were happening in large numbers. Before that day, police had killed several striking officers, and moreover that, police were known for siding with the employers slash capitalists and used force to suppress the labor activism. On May 4th, laborers and workers assembled to demonstrate and ask for 8 hours work a day. A bomb was thrown at the cops and cops started firing aimlessly, and that incident killed 7 people who were definitely innocent, and moreover that 8 workers died, including the 4 people who were executed. More than 70 were injured and hundreds were arrested. And the funny thing is, the person responsible for the bombing was never identified or found. It seems it wasn't the main goal after all. Pullman strike was a labor union protest carried out by the American Railway Union or ARU, led by Eugene V. Debs in 1894 against George Pullman and his rail cars because the workers faced wage cuts during an economic depression while the rents of the houses provided by the company was unchanged. About 250,000 workers all over the country joined them and blocked all the railroads and caused traffic. Such a big strike went unsuccessful because President Grover Cleveland deployed about 12,000 army troops to crack down the protests, causing 70 estimated deaths due to firing at the crowds, hundreds injured and hundreds arrested, including the president of American Railway Union, Eugene V. Debs, which completely destabilized the ARU and further alienated the workers and deepened their exploitation because the state now was in support of the corporates. This trend is not only seen in West. In Mexico in 2006 in the city of Oaxaca, I'm butchering its name, so pardon me. Basically, it started with a teachers' strike which asked for raise in their wages and resignation of the corrupt and repressive state governor, which was suppressed using 3,000 state thugs by the governor Ulysses Rui Ortiz. Again, pardon me for the names. But the protests didn't stop there. They were joined by APPO, or Popular Assembly of the Peoples of Oaxaca, which was an organization of Marxists, anarchists, and worker unions. The protest grew so big that APPO took over the city and it became an autonomously functioning state. Well, it was ended in few months when federal police and paramilitary forces violently cracked down on the organization. There are countless number of examples, whether be it Escobal mine protests of Guatemala, 2012 Maruti Suzuki protest of India, 2019 and 2024 farmers protests of India, 2019 fuel protests of Iran, Philippines anti-terror law protests and omnibus law protests of 2020, Black Lives Matter protests of US, and thousands more. The commonality in all this is that the policing system is used to suppress dissent and protect the interests of the people in power and states. And who controls the state? Under a neoliberal economy, it's capitalists, the oligarchs. How to win against the cop or the state thugs? The simplest answer would be mass mobilization. Well, that sure lacks some depth. And also, it's a very vague answer. Let's get from the start. So, people are being exploited and they protest. But they are silenced by the police slash state thugs. So, how can they retaliate? By more people participating in the protest. But people wouldn't come out of nowhere. That's why there should be far bigger process behind it, where people should feel disappointed and cheated with the present state. Or simply they should be aware or become conscious of the exploitations they are facing. So that will what trigger the anger of people, wake them up from exploitation, and what helps them to escape the matrix. The intellectual class of people hold the burden of educating the people and propagating the ideas and narratives which will help them to wake up from exploitation. For example, the recent Bangladesh protest, where people protested against the Bangladesh's dictator, started with students protesting against the unjust reservation for the children of the freedom fighters of Bangladesh Liberation Movement of 1971. Then the protest got big when the police injured the students. The people joined them in mass numbers because the economy was struggling, and it could also be seen on the ground that people's material conditions were deteriorating. Well, when the protest ended with the dictator fleeing the country, the police had killed 1,400 people. Well, later the movement went off road because of the reason that I'm going to talk in the next point. When people start agitating and after mass mobilization, the movement should be led by an organization or a vanguard party that was absent in Bangladesh's student protests. The movement lacked the ideology of the masses, which made the movement a kind of an apolitical protest. The movement also lacked a narrative like what are they protesting for? Is it just to dethrone a dictator or beyond that to establish a state which will work for the people? Well, that's a very different story and that is not related to this. Let's also not ignore geopolitical interests that exist behind any protests. But that's a whole other realm of discussion. There are other important things like powerful and effective narrative and organizational strategies which make mass mobilization indestructible by any kind of state thugs. To summarize, to stand against the state thugs, first you need a support base which will be possible after years of educating and causing awareness, then mass mobilization with strong narratives and influencing people. This will destabilize the state, and that's how you will fight against the cops system. Well, this video isn't complete because we just talked about how policing system was born and how some protests happened against the cops and how some protests happened against the state and the cops and how the state used those institutions to suppress them, proving that policing isn't to protect the interests of the people. That's all we talked about. But we haven't talked about how a society can live without policing system. How policing system as a system isn't even doing things that the state thugs are supposed to properly do. How they are so bad at their job and all that. But I will answer some questions which I asked in the beginning of the essay. Aren't cops are supposed to serve the public, protect the interests of the society? I think I have covered that question very extensively. The cops aren't there to protect the interests of the people, but instead the interests of the people in power. Don't they exist to jail the antisocial elements which try to break the society down, like murderers, thieves, and rapists? First, we have to define what antisocial elements mean. If we define antisocial elements as the people who will work against the society to break it down, then ask the question, why are those people are working against the society to break it down? My answer would be because they were cheated by the society. They are at the receiving end of the oppression in the society. In such a situation, why wouldn't they work against the interest of the society? So the solution to end the antisocial elements is not policing system. The solution is to improve the material conditions of the people who are being cheated. It's to end the oppression and re-educating the people. But we just talked about the policing system, but we didn't even touch how oppressive the prison system is.